She had exactly $5 left in this world, a dog with 3 legs of good sense, and 1 leg of pure stubbornness, and a town full of people who had already decided how her story would end. Ruth Calloway had buried a husband, sold a farm, and packed her whole life into a wagon that groaned louder than she did. And still she stood at the edge of Miller's Gulch with her chin up, staring at the one thing in town nobody else wanted, the old Kestler smithy. Boarded windows. A door that hung crooked on one hinge. A reputation, whispered over church pews and saloon counters alike, that something had gone wrong there, and gone wrong bad, some 15 years back. The men who ran the auction that morning had practically laughed when she raised her hand. A woman, alone but for an old copper-coated dog, bidding on cursed ground nobody else would touch. They called her a fool to her face, and worse behind her back. But Copper, her dog, her only steady thing left, had gone rigid the moment they crossed the property line, ears up, nose to the dirt, tail low and trembling with something that wasn't fear. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway and her faithful dog Copper. If you've ever been counted out before anyone gave you a real chance, if you've ever found something worth keeping in a place everyone else had already thrown away, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Stories like Ruth's remind us that the world doesn't always see what's right in front of it, and maybe you've lived a little of that yourself. The build-up 2 years before that auction, Ruth Calloway had been, by every measure the town understood, a woman with something to lose. She and her husband Daniel had worked 80 acres of wheat and pasture on the eastern edge of the county, land his father had broken with a mule and a stubborn kind of hope, land that had fed them through 3 lean winters and 1 very good one. Ruth had not been raised for farm life. Her people were from Ohio, shopkeepers and schoolteachers, and there had been a time when her mother wept at the idea of her only daughter following a young man west with nothing but a wagon and a promise. But Ruth had a way of making hard things look like they belonged to her. She learned to can peaches before she learned to love the man who'd planted the trees. She learned to shoot a rifle straight before she learned to keep a kitchen. And when Daniel brought home a copper-colored pup with 1 ear that never quite stood right, she learned, without ever meaning to, how to love something so completely that its absence would later feel like a missing rib. Copper was 3 months old when he came to the Calloway farm, all paws and no sense, prone to chasing his own shadow across the porch boards until he wore a path in the dust. Daniel had named him for the color of a new penny-catching morning light, and the dog had grown into that name slowly, filling out into a broad-chested, sharp-eyed animal, with the kind of quiet intelligence that made hired hands nervous, and made Ruth feel, on her loneliest days, less alone. He was the sort of dog who noticed things. A hawk shifting its circle in the sky an hour before a storm. A rattler coiled in shade nobody else had checked. The particular hitch in a horse's gait that meant trouble in the hoof before trouble showed itself. Daniel used to say Copper had more sense than half the men at the Grange Hall, and he wasn't wholly joking. The good years were not many, but they were sweet. There were harvest suppers where Ruth's peach preserves won a blue ribbon 2 seasons running, the mason jars catching lamplight like small captured sunsets on the long trestle tables. There were winters they weathered together, the 3 of them, woman, man, dog, wedged close around a stove, while wind screamed against the windows. Copper's warm weight pressed against Ruth's feet, the smell of wood smoke and wet wool filling every corner of the small farmhouse. There was a particular October evening, gold light slanting low across the wheat stubble, dust motes drifting lazy in the air like something out of a dream, when Daniel had taken her hand on the porch step and told her that whatever came, whatever the land decided to do to them, he counted himself lucky to have chosen her. Ruth held on to that evening the way a person holds onto a coin in a deep pocket, worn smooth from touching it too often. She remembered, too, the small things that made a marriage a life rather than an arrangement. Daniel teaching her to whistle for Copper across a hayfield, the 2 of them laughing until she got it right. The winter copper caught a rabbit and proudly deposited it, still very much alive, on the kitchen floor, sending Ruth up onto a chair with a shriek that made Daniel laugh so hard he had to sit down. The way the dog would rest his broad head on Daniel's boot every evening at exactly the same hour, as though he alone could feel the day's work settling into a man's tired bones. These were not extraordinary memories. They were ordinary ones. The kind a person doesn't know to treasure until they've been taken. 2 winters after that golden October evening, Daniel caught a fever that no doctor in 3 counties could break, and by the time the ground had thawed enough to dig his grave, Ruth Calloway was a widow at 29 with a mortgage, a bad harvest behind her, and a dog who would not leave Daniel's graveside for 3 full days, lying flat in the cold mud with his chin on his paws, refusing food, refusing water, refusing to be coaxed away by anything Ruth said or did, until hunger finally won what grief could not. What the town remembered, in the months that followed, was not Ruth's grief but her stubbornness. She refused help she deemed pity dressed up as kindness. She turned down 2 separate proposals of marriage from men who saw a widow's land as an opportunity rather than a woman as a person. Men who spoke to her as though grief had softened her mind rather than sharpened it. She worked the 80 acres alone with copper at her heel, until her hands blistered, and her back gave her trouble she'd carry the rest of her life, rising before dawn to walk the fence lines herself, learning to read weather in the color of the western sky the way Daniel once had. For 1 more season, she nearly made it work. But drought came the following summer, the kind that cracked the earth into a map of old scars, and the wheat that should have fed her through winter shriveled to nothing in the field, stalks going brittle and pale under a sun that seemed to Ruth almost personally cruel in its relentlessness. The bank in Miller's Gulch, run by a man named Elias Voss, who had wanted that land under Voss Cattle Company signage since before Daniel had ever plowed it, did not extend the mercy Ruth had hoped for. Voss sat behind his oak desk, immaculate in a way that made Ruth's calloused hands feel like an accusation, and told her, with the practiced sorrow of a man who felt none, that business was business, and the farm would need to be sold to satisfy the debt. What Ruth did not know then, though she would come to understand it with painful clarity in the years ahead, was that Voss had been quietly buying up the paper on half the failing farms in the county, patient as a spider, waiting for exactly this kind of drought to bring struggling families to his door. She was not his first ruin, she would not be his last. But we should tell you now, the debt Ruth carried out of that office would prove far smaller than the debt Elias Voss himself was about to accrue, one he would not be able to settle so easily when the reckoning finally came for him. She lost the land in November. She lost, in the same terrible month, the last physical thread connecting her to Daniel, the porch where he'd held her hand, the barn he'd built with his own back, the grave marker she now had to trust a stranger's decency to keep tended. She packed what fit in a wagon, sold what didn't, and stood one gray morning at a crossroads outside Miller's Gulch with a dog, a rifle, $41, and no earthly idea what came next. The town watched her go the way towns watch anyone who's lost, with a kind of relieved pity, glad it wasn't them, already forgetting her by supper. Voss, riding past in his fine buggy, had tipped his hat to her with a smile that did not reach his eyes, the smile of a man who has already spent the profit of another person's ruin. Ruth did not cry in front of him, she saved that for the road, where only Copper could see, his head resting heavy and warm across her lap, while the wagon wheels turned toward a future she could not yet picture. She drifted for the better part of a year, took in sewing in one town, cooked for a boarding house in another, saved every coin she could, while Copper aged from a young dog into a steady gray-muzzled companion, who had, in his own quiet way, become the only family she had left. By the time she circled back through Miller's Gulch, not because she wanted to, but because a letter about a small unclaimed inheritance from a distant cousin had summoned her there, a paltry sum that would still be more money than she'd held at once in a year. She had exactly $5 remaining after settling a debt she'd carried since the farm. $5 and a dog and a stubborn refusal to let the town that had watched her fall see her broken. It was in that condition, proud and threadbare, and unwilling to leave without one final, defiant act of ownership over her own life, that Ruth Calloway walked into the county auction being held on the courthouse steps, and saw the notice for the old Kestler smithy. The discovery. The story of the Kestler smithy was one every child in Miller's Gulch grew up half believing and half mocking, the way children do with the ghost stories their town can't quite let go of. Old Tobias Kestler had been the finest blacksmith the county had ever known, a man with hands like iron himself, and a reputation for craftsmanship that had once drawn customers from 3 territories over. But somewhere in the years before Ruth had ever arrived in Miller's Gulch, Kestler had grown strange, secretive, the old-timers said, prone to working through the night behind a locked door, prone to snapping at anyone who asked too many questions about what exactly he was forging in there. He had died alone in that smithy, found 3 days after the fact by a boy delivering coal, and no will, no family, no explanation had ever surfaced for what he'd been building in his final years, or why the county coroner's report had noted, without elaboration, that Kestler's hands bore burns and calluses far beyond what ordinary smithwork required. The smithy had sat boarded and untouched for 15 years since, passed between absentee owners who bought it for the land and never once set foot inside, cursed in whispers, avoided in fact, until the county finally moved to auction it for unpaid taxes. Ruth did not believe in curses. She had buried a husband and lost a farm, and learned, in the hardest classroom life offered, that misfortune needed no supernatural explanation, only bad luck, worse men, and a world that rarely bent toward fairness. What she believed in, standing on those courthouse steps with $5 folded in her palm, was that a building was a building, walls were walls, and a roof over her head for $5 was worth more to her practical mind than whatever ghost stories the town wanted to attach to it. She had, after all, heard the story of Tobias Kestler second-hand a dozen times in a dozen slightly different versions over the years, each telling a little more embellished than the last, until the true shape of the man had all but disappeared beneath the town's need for a good scare on a slow evening. That alone made her suspicious of the legend. Grief, she had learned firsthand, made people strange in ways the strangeness itself did not deserve to be punished for. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Pruitt, had looked almost apologetic reading out the property, as though embarrassed to be asking anyone to bid on it at all. When Ruth raised her hand, a ripple of low laughter moved through the small crowd gathered there, men in string ties nudging each other, a woman in a fine bonnet whispering behind a gloved hand loudly enough that Ruth was certainly meant to hear it. Nobody bid against her. $5, and the smithy, and everything inside it, unseen and unexamined, became hers, and Pruitt handed over the deed with the faint, uneasy relief of a man glad to finally be rid of the property's shadow on the county's books. That was the moment Copper first told her something was different. He had been calm through the whole proceeding, sitting obediently at her heel, as he always did in town, but the instant the gavel came down, and Pruitt announced the property transferred, Copper rose to his feet, and let out a low sound Ruth had heard from him only twice before in his life. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between that vibrated up through his chest like a struck bell. He turned his body fully toward the smithy, visible down the street with its crooked door and boarded windows, and his tail, usually loose and easy, went stiff and low. Ruth had learned, across 9 years with this animal, never to dismiss what his body was telling her, before his mind had words for it. Something about that building had reached him before she'd even walked through its door. They arrived at the smithy in the gray hour just after noon, the sun hidden behind a scrim of high cloud that made the whole street feel washed of color. Ruth pried the crooked door open with a groan of old hinges, and the smell that rolled out to meet her was one she would remember for the rest of her days. Cold ash long dead, the particular mineral tang of rusted iron, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the dry sweetness of old pine shavings that had never quite decayed. Copper pushed past her legs before she could stop him, nose low, moving in the deliberate, methodical way he'd once tracked a wounded calf half a mile through timber back on the farm. He was not afraid. Whatever had frightened the town for 15 years did not frighten Copper. He was working. The smithy's main room held what she expected: a cold forge, a rusted anvil, tools hung on the wall in careful rows, as though Kestler had simply stepped out one evening and never returned. But it was the back room, the one the town's stories always circled without detail, that made Ruth's breath catch. It was smaller than the forge room, windowless, and every wall was lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding dozens, perhaps hundreds of small iron and copper objects. Locks, hinges, tiny mechanical devices Ruth couldn't immediately name, all of them coated in the fine gray dust of a decade and a half of undisturbed time. Whatever obsession had consumed Tobias Kestler in his final years, it lived in this room, patient and silent, waiting. And still Copper was not satisfied. He moved past the shelves entirely, nose fixed to the packed dirt floor near the back wall, and began to whine, a high, urgent, insistent sound Ruth had heard from him exactly once before, the night a barn fire had started 2 farms over, and he'd woken the whole house before any human eye caught the smoke. He pawed at the earth, once, twice, then looked back at her with an expression she could only call pleading, as though begging her to understand what his nose already knew. We should tell you now, what Copper was standing over would turn out to be only the beginning of what that smithy was hiding, and the reason for it would reach back further than either Ruth or the town of Miller's Gulch had ever imagined. But first, she had to trust her dog enough to start digging. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light, with a rusted spade she'd found hanging by the forge, before the packed earth gave way to something that wasn't dirt at all. A wooden trapdoor, warped and swollen with age, but intact, set flush into the floor, and covered by 15 years of settled ground. Copper stood guard over the widening hole the entire time, ears pricked, body taut, occasionally letting out that same low, thrumming sound, not quite alarm, more like anticipation held on a tight leash. When the spade finally struck the trapdoor's iron ring, Ruth sat back on her heels, heart hammering, and looked at her dog. "You knew," she said softly, and Copper's tail, for the first time since they'd crossed onto the property, began to wag. Beneath the trapdoor was a narrow set of steps leading down into a root cellar Kestler must have dug and lined himself. Stone walls damp with the particular cold of earth that never saw sun, the air thick with the mineral hush of a space long sealed away from weather and light. Copper went down the steps ahead of her, unafraid, his claws clicking against stone in the dark, and Ruth followed with her lantern held high, her own breath shallow with a mixture of dread and something she didn't yet have a name for. And there, in the lantern's wavering light, Ruth Calloway found what would change the rest of her life. Not gold, not exactly, though there was some of that, a small strongbox of coin gone green with tarnish, the metal cool and heavy in her palm when she finally worked up the courage to lift its lid. What she found, stacked in careful, oilcloth-wrapped bundles along the cellar's back wall, were dozens of Kestler's finest finished works, intricate iron and silver pieces, ornamental locks and mechanisms of astonishing craftsmanship, several bearing markings she didn't recognize but would later learn were Kestler's own hallmark, a smith whose reputation, unbeknownst to the town that had buried and forgotten him, had once reached collectors and museums as far away as Denver and Chicago. She unwrapped one piece with trembling hands, a small mechanical box, no larger than a hymnal, its surface engraved with a pattern of wheat sheaves, so fine, and so lifelike, she nearly wept at the sight of it, thinking of her own lost fields. Copper sat close beside her the entire time, no longer whining now but watching her with an alertness that felt almost like pride, his tail giving one slow sweep across the dirt floor each time she uncovered something new, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that they had found something worth the careful unwrapping. He had not once, in all his searching, shown a flicker of the fear the town's stories should have warranted. He had only ever shown purpose. He had not gone mad in his final years. Ruth would come to understand, as she pieced the story together, in the weeks that followed. He had gone quiet, choosing to hoard his masterworks, rather than sell them to a town that had, by every account she'd later gather from old records, and older neighbors, mocked and undervalued him, just as they had mocked her that very morning on the courthouse steps. There was a particular kind of ache in that realization, a recognition that reached across 15 years, and a stranger's grave to touch something raw and familiar in her own chest. Curiosity, she was beginning to understand, was only the surface of what this Smithy held. Beneath it lay a story about being overlooked, that she suspected would matter to her far more than any coin ever could. The climax in Karma word travels fast in a small town, and word of what the widow Calloway had found in the cursed Smithy traveled faster than most. Ruth had been careful. She'd told no one but the county appraiser, a fair-minded older man named Higgins who'd handled Kestler's original estate, and nearly wept when he saw what had been sitting forgotten beneath the Smithy floor for 15 years. But careful is rarely enough, in a town built on gossip, and within a week, half of Miller's Gulch knew that the fool woman who'd bought the cursed Smithy for $5 had in fact bought herself a fortune. Elias Voss heard the news over his morning coffee, and by Ruth's account of that period, something in him curdled at the telling. This was, after all, the same man who had foreclosed on her farm without a flicker of mercy, the same man who had tipped his hat to her ruin with a smile he hadn't bothered to make sincere. It offended something deep and proprietary in Voss that a woman he had personally counted out, a woman he had watched leave town with nothing, might now hold more wealth than his bank had ever extended her in credit. He began, quietly at first, to inquire about the original terms of the county's tax auction, whether proper notice had been given, whether Ruth Calloway had any real legal claim to what lay beneath a building she'd bought for pocket change. He found, or invented, a technicality. A clause suggesting mineral and subsurface rights on tax-forfeited land, defaulted to the county unless explicitly transferred. A clause, Higgins would later swear, had never once been enforced in 20 years of similar sales. It didn't matter. Voss had money enough to make a technicality look like law, and he brought the matter before the county judge with the confident swagger of a man who had never once lost anything he wanted badly enough. Ruth understood, within a day of the summons arriving, exactly what she was up against. Voss did not simply want the Smithy's fortune. He wanted, more than anything, to prove that the world still worked the way he needed it to work, that women who lost everything stayed lost, that the Ruths of the world did not get to rise. It was never really about the money for him, it was about being right that she'd stay small. She could have panicked. She had, God knew, every reason to. The legal fees alone threatened to eat into the very fortune she was fighting to keep, and Higgins had warned her plainly, over strong coffee at his cluttered office desk, that county judges did not always rule against powerful men, however thin their claims. There were nights in that week before the hearing, when Ruth lay awake in the small room above the smithy she'd taken to sleeping in, copper curled heavy and warm against her side, and let herself imagine losing it all a second time, the fortune, the smithy, whatever fragile new life she'd begun building from $5 and a dog's insistent nose. She had lost everything once already. She knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that she could survive losing it again. But something had shifted in Ruth Calloway since the moment she'd knelt in that root cellar and understood that a dead man's overlooked genius had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone willing to look past a town's cruel gossip. She would not be made small again without a fight. The days before the hearing were tense in a way that settled into Copper's body as much as Ruth's. He had never, in 9 years, shown aggression toward a person, not once, not even when strangers startled him on the road. But when Elias Voss rode out to the smithy 3 days before the hearing, ostensibly to survey the disputed property, but really, Ruth suspected, to rattle her into some hasty and unfavorable settlement, Copper placed himself squarely between Voss and the cellar entrance, and would not move. He did not growl, he did not bare his teeth, he simply stood, immovable as the anvil in the forge room, staring at Voss with an intensity that made the banker's practiced smile falter for the first time Ruth had ever witnessed. "Control your animal," Voss had snapped, and Ruth, arms crossed, had answered, "He's not doing anything but standing, Mr. Voss. Same as you." Voss left without his survey. It was Higgins, the appraiser, who ultimately turned the tide, though he would always insist Ruth had done the real work herself. In the week before the hearing, Ruth had gone back through every piece Kestler had left behind, cataloging not just their value but their history, and in doing so, she'd uncovered something Voss's hurried legal maneuvering had missed entirely: a ledger, tucked into the false bottom of the strongbox, in Kestler's own cramped hand, detailing his original intent for the fortune he'd spent his last years crafting. Kestler, it turned out, had never meant to hoard his work in secret spite. He had meant it for Miller's Gulch itself. Funds set aside, in his own words, "for whatever soul finds this, and needs it more than I ever did, so long as some portion goes toward the schoolhouse my own boy never lived to attend." Kestler's son, Ruth learned from Higgins, had died young of a fever much like the one that took Daniel, and the Smith's grief-hardened, secretive final years made a different kind of sense once she understood what he'd truly been building toward all along: not treasure for its own sake, but a legacy he'd never had the chance to give. The morning of the hearing, Ruth walked into the county courthouse, with the ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth under one arm, and Copper trotting steady at her heel. Having refused, with a quiet stubbornness Higgins finally gave up arguing against, to leave her dog waiting outside. The courtroom was fuller than she'd expected. Word had spread, and half of Miller's Gulch had turned out, some out of genuine curiosity, others, she suspected, simply hoping to watch the widow Calloway lose a second time. Voss sat at his table in a fine gray suit, composed and confident, exchanging low words with his lawyer, and when his eyes met Ruth's across the room, he offered her the same thin, joyless smile he'd given her the day the bank took her farm. It did not shake her the way it once might have. She had already survived the worst thing that smile could promise her. That ledger changed everything in the courtroom. Voss's claim to subsurface mineral rights collapsed the instant Higgins produced, not just the legal precedent showing the clause had never once been enforced on comparable properties, but Kestler's own testamentary intent, handwritten and unmistakable, naming no institution, and no bank, but simply, "whoever finds this, and does right by it." Ruth watched the color drain slowly from Voss's face, as Higgins read the passage aloud, watched the confident set of his shoulders begin, almost imperceptibly, to sag. The judge, a weathered man named Alton who had, it turned out, lost his own young son decades before, and understood exactly the kind of grief that drove a man to secret, obsessive work, took a long moment, reading the ledger himself before he spoke, and when he finally set it down, his voice carried none of the doubt Ruth had feared. He ruled, without much hesitation, in Ruth's favor. Voss's technicality dissolved into what it had always truly been: the last grasping act of a man who could not bear to watch someone he'd once discarded rise higher than his own contempt for her. Copper, sitting quietly beside Ruth's chair through the entire proceeding, rose the moment the gavel fell, and pressed his broad head against her knee, and Ruth realized, with her hand resting on his familiar warm fur, that she was finally, fully, breathing again. The final humiliation, if it could be called that, came not from the courtroom, but from the town itself. Word of Kestler's ledger spread even faster than word of the fortune had, and the story that emerged, a grieving Smith's secret legacy, discovered by a widow the town had mocked, defended by a loyal, level-headed dog who'd stood his ground against the county's most powerful man, was simply too good, too human, for Miller's Gulch not to embrace. People who had laughed at Ruth on the courthouse steps now stopped her on the street to apologize, some sincerely, some merely eager to be remembered kindly by a woman who suddenly mattered, and Ruth found she could forgive most of them, if not forget, because she understood now, better than she ever had, how easily a town's fear could curdle into cruelty when it didn't understand what it was looking at. Ruth did exactly what Kestler's ledger had asked of her, and more. She funded the schoolhouse he'd named, complete with a small brass plaque bearing his son's name, a boy the town had entirely forgotten until Ruth made certain they never could again. She used a portion of the fortune to establish a small relief fund for widows and families facing exactly the kind of foreclosure that had once cost her everything. A fund administered, pointedly, through a different bank than Voss's. One Ruth herself helped oversee, meeting personally with every family who came to her for help, so that none of them would ever have to sit across an oak desk from a man who felt nothing for their loss. And she kept the smithy itself, restoring it not as a monument to curse or tragedy, but as a working forge once more, teaching herself Kestler's trade slowly and carefully from his own meticulous notes, until the ring of hammer on iron became, for the first time in 15 years, a sound Miller's Gulch associated with life rather than loss. Copper spent his remaining years exactly where he'd always belonged, curled by the forge's warmth on winter afternoons, greeting every visitor to the shop with the same steady, watchful dignity that had first led Ruth down into that cellar, and the townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid the cursed Smithy, now brought their children by simply to meet the dog who'd found a fortune, scratching his broad copper head while Ruth worked the iron behind them, humming some tune Daniel used to whistle across a long-ago hayfield. Voss, for his part, did not recover so gracefully. The county's scrutiny of his failed legal maneuver uncovered, in the way these things tend to unravel once someone finally starts pulling the thread, several other properties where his bank's foreclosure practices had skirted well past what any fair reading of the law allowed. Within a year, he'd lost his position, lost the confidence of investors who valued their own reputations more than his friendship, and lost, most bitterly of all, the one thing he'd always assumed was permanently his, the town's automatic deference to his word over anyone else's. He left Miller's Gulch quietly, without the fanfare of his own long-ago hat tip to Ruth's ruin, and few in town could later say they missed him. Outro. There is a particular kind of justice in a story like Ruth Calloway's, one that has less to do with fortune found beneath a cursed floor, and more to do with what people choose to see, and what they choose to overlook. The whole town of Miller's Gulch walked past that smithy for 15 years, and saw only a dead man's tragedy, a curse not worth the risk of examining closely. It took a woman with nothing left to lose, and a dog with a nose for what mattered, to look past what everyone assumed, and find, instead, a legacy patiently waiting for someone willing to dig. Perhaps that's the real inheritance Ruth Calloway received that gray November afternoon. Not the coin, not even the schoolhouse bearing a forgotten boy's name, but the quiet, hard-won knowledge that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than anyone standing in judgment ever bothered to check. So we'll leave you with the same question that stayed with Ruth long after the courtroom doors closed behind her. If you found a hidden piece of history, something the world had written off, something everyone else walked past, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or would you find a way to share it forward, the way she did? We'd love to know what you'd choose. Until next time, stay close.